This is really an honor to get to make this introduction. I've heard this presentation before, and we are in for a treat. And I was just explaining the connection that we all should have with what happened during World War II and the executive order that was signed. In this building, Min Yasui, who was a lawyer, and went out of his way because he wanted to challenge the curfew law that was imposed through the executive order. He marched up and down Broadway after curfew and said to police, "Arrest me." And they didn't. So finally he went to Central Precinct and said, "Here are my papers." And first they said, "Go home." And then finally they took him into custody because he wanted to bring a challenge against the executive order. Ultimately he was convicted, and he was held in this building in a cell up on the 8th floor, in a cell that had absolutely no access to sunlight, couldn't see the sky. We've located which cell it is, and we've visited it, and there is an effort now to preserve it so that we all remember. For 9 months in solitary confinement. And it turns out that he was a good friend of our speaker, and he, I'm sure, will touch on that a bit. So these are important lessons for us to learn and not to forget. And I think we all know that when we forget history, we suffer the possibility of repeating history. And this is not a part of our history that we can risk repeating. And I think that we've all seen that there are challenges that we face, and so it's important to keep the lessons of history close at hand. On December 7th, 1941, George Nakata was a 9-year-old American citizen. A few weeks later, he was an enemy alien. Why did this happen? And that's what we're going to hear about today. Why was he, along with his family, thrown into an American concentration camp? What happened to the Constitution during that period of time? George survived those years behind barbed wires and is here today to share his story. And I think that this is really a story that few of us have heard and really understand, and some people don't believe. And I think that it's important. I knew nothing about the jail cell and Min Yasui's story until I went to a presentation, and we're hoping that we're going to have a presentation for our court and for the legal community about Min Yasui's story and the jail cell. This is the 75th, is that correct, anniversary of the executive order being signed. And so this is an important year. So we're really fortunate to have George Nakata talking to us today and to put this into perspective as to what happened then and what the risks remain in terms of our Constitution. So it is with great pleasure I will let George take over. He's a Lincoln Cardinal, as am I, so we have another connection.
This is Lincoln High School Cardinals have got to stick together. Just like it's good to see my Professor Steverson, the Diversity Dean out of Lewis and Clark, because I was also a pioneer and graduated from Lewis and Clark. So good to have a few friends in the audience. I also want to thank Maya here, who made all of the fine arrangements. Thank you very much. So it's a great opportunity to just share with you some thoughts and comments. I'll kind of ramble at times, kind of tell you some personal stories. You know, it was 230 years ago that our founding fathers signed the U.S. Constitution. 230 years ago. The U.S. Constitution, the supreme law of the land. It's the roadmap for our country's destiny. The U.S. Constitution. But have we as citizens really abided by the U.S. Constitution? Have we been careless with it? Have we made some mistakes with it? Even today, as you turn on your television set and read the Oregonian, do you see? You read about the toppling of monuments. You read about opposition protesters opposing other protesters. You see partisanship. Partisanship to an extreme. Partisanship seems more important than the first word of USA. I get a little concerned when I watch TV and read the newspapers. So today I have a little story to share with you. It's a story of a people. A story of a people that had their freedom and civil rights stripped away from them. And it's a story that kind of goes back in history. You know, history is a great thing. History is a great teacher. I wished that we could review history from time to time. I wish America would read its Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, every July 4th. That's maybe a dream of mine, but it comes to reality. You know, 56 people signed the U.S. Constitution, 56. Did you know that 41 of them were owners of slaves? These are the kinds of reality that we as Americans have got to review and think about from time to time. It was 7.5 decades ago that then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an executive order. That executive order had a number to it, 9066. And that executive order was life-shattering. Life-shattering to 120,000 Japanese. I happen to be one of them. So today, I'd like to share that story with you. But before I do, I'd like to kind of review very briefly a little bit about America. All of us in this room tend to forget, you know, we're a very young country. That statement will probably fly by and you won't think about it too much. But many of you have been to Europe, have been to Asia, where countries are thousands of years old, thousands of years old. And we're just, what, 250 years old? We don't realize. I was in Pendleton a few weeks ago. I met the elders of the Umatilla tribe and the Walla Walla tribe. How many of you realize that they were there for 10,000 years here in Oregon? And our country is only 240, 50 years old. The Native Americans, the indigenous people. How many of you drive around Portland and you just kind of take it for granted? Names: Multnomah, Klamath, Clatskanie, Umatilla, Umpqua, Chinook, Walla Walla, Nez Perce, Warm Springs. They are all people that were here far before us. Far before the Europeans came here and took the land away from them. There were 562 Native American nations in America. In the 1700s, we, America, put together 400 treaties with them, 400, and proceeded to violate all 400. That's a story for another day. But it's good to review history. We have some serious bumps in implementing the U.S. Constitution. You know, in 1790, 1792, America passed its very first Naturalization Act, citizenship. In order to be a citizen of this great country of ours, you had to be two things. You had to be free and you had to be white. All people of color couldn't even dream of being a citizen of this country. We hear about immigrants. Let's be real. Everybody in this room, we are all immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Maybe it's your great-grandfather. Maybe your great-grandmother. All of us, unless you're an indigenous Native American, You are an immigrant or a descendant of an immigrant that came from Europe, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, from someplace. We tend to forget that. They talk about immigrants as foreign people. We are immigrants. But we tend to forget those kinds of simple historical facts. How many of you have been out to the Statue of Liberty? Many of you. My son's a lawyer. He practiced in New York, and I went there several times, and I went out to the Statue of Ellis Island, and you know, the Statue of Liberty is a great thing. Holding the torch, the tablet with 1776 written thereon, and on the bottom of the base there's a poem. Maybe some of you read that poem, written by a Jewish lady. And at the center, it's a short poem, in the center it says, "Give me your tired, give me your poor, give me your masses so that they can breathe freely." That's what it says on the base of the Statue of Liberty. That one sentence in the middle of the simple poem, doesn't it say it all? That's what America is all about. So those of us, tired, poor masses, can breathe freely. So Europeans flocked to America. They came by the thousands. And they took over this great land of ours. But in the meantime, what was happening on the West Coast? Asians were coming here. Asians. There was no Statue of Liberty on the West Coast. There was no welcome wagon. Rather, we were faced with a different situation. They didn't like Asians. Anglo-Saxon Caucasians disliked Asians in a very basic sort of way. They called us names. The Yellow Peril. Many, many names. They didn't dislike us. They hated us. The governor, the mayor, leaders, neighbors, school teachers. I know. Governor Sprague at that time, Mayor Earl Riley was the mayor of Portland. They hated Japanese. That's the reality. That's not printed in the Oregon Journal or the Oregonian. But that happens to be a matter of fact. You see, Japanese flocked to America for economic reasons. They didn't come from Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, the big cities. They came from the rural areas, like my father, a former rice farmer from Okayama, Japan. Why? At the end of the Edo period and the beginning of the Meiji period, Japan wanted to modernize itself after Admiral Perry and his Commodore black ships entered Edo Bay, Tokyo Bay, and said, "Japan, open up your doors. You must trade with the rest of the world." And they did. And they started to build factories and modernize the cities. And in the meantime, the farmers of Japan were heavily taxed. Their taxes were doubled and tripled like my father's. He no longer could farm and make a living growing rice. And so the thousands of farmers of Japan looked. They looked to Canada, to Peru, to Brazil, and yes, to the west coast of America. And they immigrated by the thousands. Japanese people that didn't speak English, they came to the west coast, to a strange land, strange people, eating different food, and the West Coast then became their home of choice. Leaving their home of birth to start a new life in this land of opportunity. But what happens when the mayor doesn't like you and your neighbor across the street looks cross-eyed at you and school teachers dislike you and you go to a shop and they don't serve you, they're serving everybody else and they're totally ignoring you, wanting to buy your goods? What happens? Human nature sets in. Here's what happens. You tend to band together by human nature with people of your own kind. People that speak the same language, eat the same food, have the same customs. That's what happens. You band together. And that's what created Japantown. I've had friends ask me, George, how did Japantown ever come to be? And I tell them, that's a good question. It wasn't a town in Japan that pulled up and landed here in Portland, Oregon. That's not how it works. When you get rejected by community and society and state and government, you band together with people of your own kind. 49 Japantowns up and down the West Coast, from San Diego to Seattle. Here in Oregon, a Japantown in Hood River. In Salem, in Milwaukee, Gresham, and Montevilla. The biggest Japantown of all was right here, a few blocks from here, northwest Portland. From the Willamette River up to 5th. From Ankeny Street to Gleason Street. That 22-block area, that was Japantown. Hotels, restaurants, a school, a doctor, a dentist. We had a bathhouse. We had a fish market. We had a confectionery. That was Japantown. I know. I lived there. I grew up there. That was a vibrant community. Nihon Machi. In Japanese, Nihon Machi, Japantown. That was Portland's Japantown. A thriving community. As a young boy, I could walk around, safe, knowing people. The editor of the Japanese newspaper, Mr. Oyama. Mr. Matsushita, who the Teikoku store there on 3rd and Davis. My dentist, Dr. Koyama. On and on. Friends of mine that lived there. But in the 1930s, history will tell you that America was very mad at Japan. Japan as a nation and America as a country were having very serious problems during the 1930s. And all of you know, when America gets mad at you, it's very, very difficult. Ask Cuba, ask Pakistan, ask Syria, ask Afghanistan, and now North Korea. At that time, they didn't like a couple of countries in Europe, and they didn't like Japan. They placed an embargo on Japan. Now think about that last statement. Japan is a country of of islands, hundreds of islands. You only know 4 of them: Honshu, Shikoku, Hokkaido, Kyushu. But Japan is a nation island. They have no natural resources. They have to import natural resources to survive. And when America says, we're not trading with you, think of what that does to a country. So Japan and America was rattling sabers at each other. The ambassador in Washington, D.C. was given a letter of 11 demands that were impossible to meet. Your Japanese in America must all speak fluent English. Impossible demands made of the ambassador. So Japan and America were not getting along. America's FBI had a hit list of 1,370 Japanese that lived on the West Coast. 78 right here in Portland. They said, these people are dangerous. They might be spies, espionage, overthrow our government. Really? After the war, I looked at that list. A Shinto priest, Mr. Izumi, who was a florist, my dentist, Dr. Koyama's on that list. Dr. Benjamin Tanaka, who removed my tonsils as a little boy. Dr. My school teacher, on that list. What do you mean spies? But the FBI, they had all these people on the list. And suddenly, of course, December 7th of 1941, Pearl Harbor, terrible. Hundreds of American naval personnel lost their lives there on the battleship destroyers, cruisers, anchored in Pearl Harbor. Yes, the start of World War II. America declares war on Japan and on Italy and on Germany. Many of you have never experienced a world war. This is World War, folks. This is not just a Gulf War, a Korean War. It is not just Afghanistan or Yemen. This is World War. The entire world at war. Axis, the Allies. In America, you're smashing down tin cans. You're serving your energy. Sugar is on ration. This is a different world in America when it's that World War. That's what it was. The start of World War II, December 7th of 1941. Even on that day, our Japanese community, we're Americans. We made a conscious choice. This is our country. We may look Asian, we may look Japanese, but we are Americans. There was a program in Norse Hall in Northeast Portland. Japanese dancing and singing. 125 people went there because they already had tickets. Yes, the war had started, but they went there, including my friend Lilly Kobayashi. Lilly Kobayashi and her mother and father went to the performance on that night of December 7th, 1941. A few minutes after the program started, the lights go back on, two gentlemen get up on stage, identify themselves as from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they list off 11 names of people they want to see in the back of the auditorium, including Mr. Kobayashi. Lily and her mother continued to watch the performance. But her father doesn't return to his seat. So she goes back to try to find her father, and she did, as he was being handcuffed and led away, and she did not see her father for over 2 years. Portland, Oregon. It happened. It will not appear in the Oregon Journal or Oregonian or in your textbooks, but that's what happened. There are 78 such stories. Mr. Matsushima, Yoji Matsushima is one of my closest friends. He had the untold store. Some of you have shopped there. Mr. Matsushima owned the Teikoku Mercantile Company on Northwest 3rd and Davis. All of us in Japantown shopped there. They had everything. Rice, Japanese records, books, judo equipment, everything. Canned goods, bamboo shoots, everything. Everything the Japanese families would need. Mr. Matsushima would greet all his customers, a friendly guy. We'd always talk to Mr. Matsushima. But on December the 9th of 1941, Mr. Matsushima, who lived above his store, all of us in Japantown, by the way, we lived behind the shop, above a garage. This is Japantown. I didn't know what a house was. We had no front yard. We had no porch. Our home was behind the store, above a fish market. That was Japantown. So Mr. Matsushima was above his store in his small apartment. A rap on the door, and two men come in, identify themselves as from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Matsushima, you're being arrested. Mrs. Matsushima, who spoke no English, was in panic, crying. The two boys, the two sons, running around. Papa's being arrested. They gave them 35 minutes to collect his toothbrush, toilet articles, a warm jacket, a hat, boots. Handcuffed him, brought him downstairs, and Mr. Matsushima told me the whole story after the war. They threw him in the back of a patrol car with a screen between the driver and the passenger seat. They drove him out to Southeast Portland to Rocky Butte Jail. They threw him in a cell, and the next morning they gave him so-called breakfast. Breakfast with oatmeal and black coffee. Now, they didn't put that metal tray inside his cell. They put it outside his cell. So Mr. Matsushima had to reach between the bars, pick up whatever oatmeal he could, most of it dribbling down his face and onto the floor. As he told me, George, I was treated like a rat. 2 weeks in the Rocky Butte Jail. And then on to a federal detention camp in Missoula, Montana. Then on to New Mexico, Arkansas, and finally ended up in a place called Crystal City, Texas. Another story. 78 such stories here in the City of Roses, Portland, Oregon, to Japanese citizens. Mr. Oyama, the editor, he was treated likewise, that way. I don't have time to tell you more stories, but those couple of stories will tell you what happened when the hysteria of war sets in and the FBI is given unbridled authority to do whatever you want with those dirty Japs. That's what happened here in Portland, Oregon. We in Japantown, we were confused. We didn't know what was going to happen because some of us are being arrested by the FBI. 1942. As Giswalla mentioned, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066. An executive order that gave unbridled authority to the military to arrest, incarcerate, and imprison all Japanese on the West Coast. For what? I'm a citizen. Isn't there a Bill of Rights? Isn't there the amendments? Isn't there a U.S. Constitution? I didn't commit a crime. I had no trial. I had no due process. I was guilty of only one thing. My people. Only guilty of who we are. That's the only thing we were guilty of. So General John DeWitt, the Western commander, then put out orders, what they called Exclusion Orders. This particular general, if you want to read about him, he hated Japanese. He appeared before U.S. Congress on 3 different occasions and said, senators, representatives, a Jap is a Jap. It doesn't matter whether he's a citizen or not. Ship them back all to Japan. He hated Japanese. This was the man that was given unbridled authority by the Secretary of War and FDR to do as he pleases with the Japanese on the West Coast. And he did. Exclusion orders, 80 by August of 1942. Every other day he seemed like he was sending us exclusion orders. He set up these so-called civil control stations up and down the West Coast. There was one right in the middle of Japantown. My father did not speak fluent English, so I went with him to the little control station right on 3rd Avenue, Northwest. I remember that gentleman sitting in this desk, pointing up at us and says, "Oh yes, Nakata 15066. I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "That's your family number, 15066. I didn't even have a social security number. Now I had a family number, 15066. He said, "Now I'm going to institute a curfew," General DeWitt said. "No Japanese will leave their home after 8 o'clock p.m. until 6 o'clock the following morning." Immediately, restaurants closed, businesses, you can't operate with a curfew. And then came the order in April of 1942. You are all to be evacuated. We are removing you from your homes. And he had a list of things to bring, and a list of things you cannot bring. Do bring warm clothing, mittens, gloves, earmuffs, boots, work clothes, rain jackets. But don't bring any sharp implements. Don't bring any cameras. Don't bring any radios. If you were caught with a camera inside a camp, it was a $5,000 fine. 1942. Today, that would be a $72,000 fine. And my guess is most of you in this room have a smartphone, a Samsung, an iPhone. You could take pictures. If you were incarcerated and put into a camp, you would be today fined $72,000. Just one small example. So there we were, totally confused in Nihonmachi, Japantown, May the 5th of 1942. I remember with only that which we could carry. My jacket with a dangling tag, 15066. My father and mother had destroyed or given away or sold everything. Remember, reflect back for a moment. These are folks that immigrated from Japan, pulled up their roots, gave up everything, their loved ones, everything, came to America and made do. Most bachelors worked in the railroad, the fish canneries, and the lumberyard. They saved their money. They then bought business in Japantown. My father had the Pomona Hotel, and then he had 2 markets on Columbia Boulevard. He had 3 businesses. He was an entrepreneur. I'm very proud of my father. 3 businesses, and he lost it all with Executive Order 9066. That, he was not alone. That's symbolic of the people in Japantown. They lost it all. Oh, there are stories that you gave some things to friends to keep with for you until you get back. There are farmers that had tractors and harrowing machines and discs that they gave their neighboring farmer. Please keep that until I come back whenever the war is over. A few were lucky. 90% of us lost everything. The tractor that they lent out was no longer in sight when they got back. The valuables that they gave a trusted neighbor was not to be seen. That's the reality. So that's what happened. I can give you many examples. My mother weeping as she had to get rid of her silk kimono that she brought over from Okayama, Japan. She was an ex-school teacher. My sister Mary with her full set of Japanese dolls. In Japan, festivals are very important. Girls' Day, Boys' Day, there are many, many festivals. A full set of Japanese dolls, you have to get rid of all of them. I had a full set of Boys' Day dolls. Kintaro. In Japanese, that means golden boy. The golden boy statue. That was my favorite as a youngster. My favorite Boys' Day festival doll. My mother said, I can't bring that to camp. I cried. I had to get rid of Golden Boy, my favorite statue. Those are things that happen. You know, 1939, my parents bought a General Electric radio. And those of you may never have seen anything like it. Those radios were large pieces of furniture. They called them console radios. Big piece of mahogany, cost $100, 1939. Big money, 1939. $100. When the war broke out, they can't bring that radio to camp. We could only carry it. They sold it to a policeman on the beat for $5. Those are the kinds of economic hardships that we went through back in 1942. So that which we could carry, we get aboard buses there in Nihonmachi. And they drive us out to North Portland to, at that time, the North Portland Livestock Yard. Yes, the livestock yard. To be our home. They call it the Expo Center now. And I've been there like you have, to a boat show, a remodel show, a garden show. But I have different thoughts when I entered that building, the current Expo building. I remember it as the Portland Assembly Center. The home for 3,676 Japanese, uprooted, evacuated from their homes, brought into that building. I remember the first day on May the 5th of 1942 entering that building. Stepping into that building and the pungent odor of manure seeping through the wooden floors. The smell of livestock urine permeating throughout the building. Fly paper, black with flies, hung all over. Portland Assembly Center, a classic case of euphemism. Portland Assembly Center. To those of us in that building, it was a barbed wire barn. Barbed wire circling the entire place. Army guards marching around, some with fixed bayonets. You know, I remember as a young boy, I was frightened. I've never seen an M1 rifle with looked like a sword pointing out. Looking around, guard towers, spotlights. That was the Portland Assembly Center. 3,600 plus of us in that building. A maze of plywood, stalls. Our stall was 14 by 19 feet, 8 foot tall. Had 4 army cots. On the army cots were these canvas bags. They ordered us to take that canvas bag into the center. There's an arena. There's a big pile of hay. Stuff that hay into these canvas bags. That was to be your mattress. Portland assemblies. I remember going to the mess hall. We ate in 2 shifts, about 1,800 of us per shift. I remember looking down the table, long wooden table one day, and everybody had on their plate, still left, this piece of mutton. I'm not talking about rack of lamb. I'm talking about old sheep. So old and tough as lead that you couldn't cut it. And I remember on every plate, nobody could eat their mutton. Just a small example. You know, I was used to Japanese food in Japantown. I was given strange food that I was not accustomed to. But you have to eat it because that's all you have. I remember taking a shower first time there at the Portland Assembly Center. For those of you that know a little bit about the Japanese culture, Japanese like to take baths, what they call ofuro. We scrub ourselves clean and then get into a soaking tub. That's the Japanese way. And it's so soothing at the end of the day. A warm, soaking tub, and you kind of forget the worries of the day. The ofuro, a traditional Japanese bath. That's what we all had in Japantown. Now here I am at this place, and I'm in this line with this little towel, waiting to get into this row of 12 different shower heads. I've never taken a shower in my life. I go in there and I don't even know how to turn on the knobs. But I manage that. In the shower, the water starts coming out and I'm standing there bewildered. I look to my right and here's a Japanese gentleman with his infant son taking a shower. I look to my left and this elderly Japanese gentleman speaking Japanese to me. And I'm standing in this shower, bewildered, wondering, why am I here? What happened to my comfortable life in Japantown there in Northwest Portland? Such thoughts went through all of our minds there, incarcerated in this barbed wire barn. The summer of 1942, exceedingly hot. I remember stepping outside the building and listening to the merriment and the fun that was going on at Jansen Beach Fun Center. Some of you remember years ago out there was a Jansen Beach Fun, a Ferris wheel, a dipper, all this stuff. I hear all the people laughing, and here I am there looking behind at the barbed wires. Those are the realities of what happened to us in the summer of '42. Then comes September. The permanent American concentration camps are now ready. We are to be moved from these temporary way stations to permanent concentration camps. So we're bussed down to the Union Station. We get aboard trains with that which we could carry. I remember getting on the trains, the military police marching up and down the aisles, ordering us to pull the window shades down because we're not to see where we were going. Remember, this is 1942. We're not a mobile society like we are today. People didn't fly, nobody flew. Not everybody had cars. This is 1942. I rarely left Japantown. Our family had never been east of Multnomah Falls. Now I'm on this train, headed someplace. The only thing I knew is we were headed east. And it rolls on for hours. And in the darkness of night, they ordered us to deboard and on board some more buses. Here we are in the sea of sagebrush. That's all we could see. 19.5 miles northeast of Twin Falls, Idaho. And in the moonlight, we could see it looked like a sea of barracks. Army barracks, tar paper barracks, uninsulated barracks. Hundreds of them. This is Minidoka. Minidoka, one of 10 American concentration camps that housed 120,000 Japanese. There's Manzanar, Topaz, Heart Mountain, Tule Lake, and those of us from Seattle, Spokane, Tacoma, Portland, we went to Minidoka. Minidoka is a Shoshone word that means vast expanse, and indeed it was, in the middle of nowhere. 44 blocks, each block with 12 barracks, each barrack with 6 units from A to F, a mess hall, a laundry room, a shower room. They brought us to a place, this is block number 34. I remember a man with a clipboard. Oh yes, family number 15066. You are in barrack number 6. You know, to this day, I can still remember my mother, father, my sister Mary, and I finding barrack number 6, Unit A. Block 34, barrack 6, Unit A, for family number 15066. Here we are incarcerated. As mentioned earlier, yes, I was at one time an American citizen. I guess now I'm an enemy alien. There, behind barbed wires, in this remote, desolate, dusty place called Minidoka. In our little unit, there's a pot-belly stove, and in the corner, a little batch of coal. And it didn't take me very long to figure out they gave us the poorest grade of coal. We learned that quickly in Minidoka. We're not coal experts. We're not from Philadelphia or Pennsylvania or Virginia, the coal mining areas of America. There are 3 grades of coal. We had grade number 3, the worst. And we knew because it creates very little heat and a whole lot of ash. That's the worst. And my job as a young boy was to clean out the ash twice a day. And I remember so well, the poorest grade of coal. That's good enough for those Japs in this camp. That's how it was. When we first arrived at Minidoka, block number 34 did not have water. The plumbing was not hooked up. In fact, the camp was really not completed yet. Now, think about that for a moment, folks. No water. That is against the Geneva Convention. I, as a young boy, had to go up to block number 36 with 2 pails, fill them with water twice a day, bring them back so my family could have something to brush their teeth with and something to drink. That's how it was. Our introduction to Minidoka. We lined up for everything. We lined up for the mess hall. I remember in the mess hall there was kind of this big crowbar, and a man would hit the crowbar that would kind of ring out, and we'd know it would be time to eat. We lined up to eat, we lined up to do our laundry, we lined up to take a shower. I remember lining up, you know, once a week to get our 2 rolls of toilet paper. We lined up for everything. That's how it is in camp. But the Japanese people, if I may, are industrious people. They elected a block manager. They asked who could cook in the mess hall. They asked who were teachers on the outside. Can you start schools? Can you start a class? Yes, we had teachers, we had doctors, we had dentists. But we had no equipment. And thank goodness for the Quakers and the Red Cross. They sent us used books, used desks, a used x-ray machine, a dental drill, and suddenly we had a makeshift dental office. They started a hospital down in Block 5. We had excellent doctors. We had school teachers, but not enough. In the beginning, we had 700 in our particular grade school and only 9 or 10 teachers. You can't have 70 people in a class. Those of you in education know that. So the superintendent went out to Twin Falls, Eden, and Jerome, Idaho, and recruited more teachers. Not popular. For American Caucasian people to go in and teach Japanese people, that's not too good. But luckily we got teachers. We got good teachers. I remember them well. Mrs. Morton, Mrs. Kleinkoff. Mrs. Kleinkoff was my favorite teacher of all times. Her husband was the superintendent of education in Minidoka. I remember in the 6th grade, Mrs. Kleinkoff would read to us one chapter from the book Lassie Comes Home every day. And I remember getting all excited to go the next day to see what happened to Lassie. Mrs. Kleinkoff, my favorite teacher. You know, fast forward to 1976 for just a moment. My wife and I were going to attend an international trade conference in Sun Valley, and we happened to go to Twin Falls. And I said to my wife, Kate, well, I've got to stop. Maybe I can catch my favorite teacher, Edith Kleinkoff. I went to a phone booth. They had many of them in those days. You put in your money and dial up. And somebody answers and says, this is Arthur Kleinkoff. I says, oh, Dr. Kleinkoff. My name's George Nakata. I was in Stafford School. Your wife was my teacher. You came to our room because your wife taught our class. She was my favorite teacher. And I'm just passing through on my way to a conference. May I kindly speak to my favorite teacher, Edith Kleinkoff. And there's this long pause, and Dr. Kleinkoff finally says to me, George, we lost Edith last week. I was stunned. I dropped the phone. My wife had to come. I said, what's wrong? These are things that happen. These are memories of Minidoka that I shall never forget. So there we are in Minidoka. We make that sagebrush land produce. There's an agronomist, a graduate from Oregon State, somehow diverted the water from the North Snake River Canal and made good land somehow, some way. And he grew Japanese eggplant, nasu, and daikon and nappa. He grew Japanese vegetables. Suddenly, the food in the mess hall became better because we grew our own food. So we dug a hole, made it into a swimming pool. I mean, we had a little board as our diving. It was not really a swimming, it was a mud hole. But we enjoyed it. We had a little fence that we made with sticks to play baseball. I got to play quite a bit of sports. Our team, we had 2 mitts. The catcher and the first baseman had a mitt with 2 bats, one of which was cracked with a nail in it. But we made do. You do that in these kinds of times. That was Minidoka. Minidoka, and we stayed there for the duration of the war. Let me tell you what happened in 1943. In 1943, the U.S. Department of Army decided, you know, those folks in these concentration camps, they may not be as dangerous as we first suspected. There's not one single case of spy, espionage, nothing. 0. 120,000 people and not one case against anybody violating anything against the U.S. government. In any case, in 1943, they decided, why don't we draft some of those young men and form a total segregated army unit? They should do that. So they did. And people from Minidoka and Manzanar and Topaz and Hart Mountain, they volunteered, along with people from Hawaii, and they created the 100th Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They trained in Fort Shelby, Mississippi, and they went on to fight in Europe. Another segment of several thousand formed the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service. Japanese that Niseis like myself that could speak and translate Japanese. They went to the Pacific Theater, decoded messages for the American Naval Marine troops. Admiral Nimitz said that MIS unit, made up entirely of Japanese Americans, shortened the Pacific War by 2 years and saved over 2 million lives. But it's never written about, is it? The 442nd Regimental Combat Team fought in North Africa, and in Italy, and in Germany, and in France. This was the unit that saved the lost Texas Battalion, totally surrounded by the Nazi troops, where two other American battalions did not succeed in saving the Texas Battalion. The 442nd was given that assignment, and under heavy casualty, they saved the Texas Battalion. I say that really with a heavy heart. I know of personal friends that gave the supreme sacrifice. The 442nd lost 800 Japanese Americans, saving the Texas unit 220 survivors. Costly, very costly. The 442nd liberated the town of Briere on the French and German border. For 50 years thereafter, the people of Briere flew over a Nisei Japanese American to help them celebrate every year the Liberation Day for Briere. Many of you know of the terrible Holocaust, the terrible sufferings of the Jewish people, totally racial. I can name you camps. One camp in particular, Dachau, not far from Munich. I've been to Dachau. Dachau is not one camp, it is several camps. Slave camp, gas chambers, slaughterhouses, terrible. I remember seeing a gravesite, very plain, with a simple plaque. Here lies 1,000 Jews. Inhumane, isn't it? That's how it was. The biggest subcamp of Dachau was liberated by the 442nd. They went in and blew off the lock, opened the gates. The Jewish people could not come streaming out, could not come running out, because they couldn't. They were skin and bones. They crawled out. They came out and stopped, because suddenly the soldiers there looked Asian. They were startled. But the Japanese Americans said, don't worry. We happen to be Japanese Americans, but we are U.S. Army. You are now free. Again, a story that doesn't find its way into textbooks. The biggest subcamp of Dachau, liberated by the totally segregated 442nd. I have friends that served in the 442nd. One of my best friends, Art Iwasaki, out at Hillsborough, had a nice nursery. Just passed away a few weeks ago. Shrapnel still in his body. Fine gentleman. He was part of the 442nd. You know, the 442nd, it was a unit that I didn't know about until I was there in Minidoka at Christmas time, running around Minidoka, looking at the mess hall that would decorate itself, and I would see on the window a plaque with a gold star. And I asked my friend, what is that? And my older friend explained to me that that family that lives in that unit lost a son fighting for America. I walked on and saw a plaque, a little banner with 2 gold stars. And yes, the family that lived in that unit lost 2 sons fighting for America. That's the 442nd. The 442nd. In the annals of American military history, the most highly decorated. Another story that you won't hear. 9,462 Purple Hearts, 22 Medal of Honors, hundreds of Bronze Stars, medals and ribbons. The 442nd. Fighting and giving their supreme sacrifice where their mother and fathers and loved ones and relatives were incarcerated in American concentration camps back here in America. Now, America isn't proud of that. Why would they put that into history books? They don't. I gave a little talk at Lincoln High School. They just started a program called Ethnic Studies. The Portland School District didn't have anything like that until 3 years ago. So I asked some of the students, how much of this do you know? And he said, well, there's a little paragraph now in our history book. Really? Well, that's progress. 10 years ago, there wasn't even that short paragraph. So things move, things change. You know, the war ends in August of 1945. They tell us, you're now free to go home. So we went down to the Twin Falls rail yard. They gave us $25 and a ticket back to where we came from, in our case, Portland. We got on the train with that which we can carry. I had a little piece of greasewood as my lone souvenir from Minidoka. Amongst the sea of sagebrush, there's these different kinds of manzanita kind of bush that you can peel off the bark and polish up, and we would make things out of it called greasewood. I still have it in my home, my one souvenir from Minidoka. We got on that train, and this time the window shades are up. We're coming back. I'll never forget a man in our compartment, a very elderly Issei, first generation Japanese. When we rounded the bend halfway home, he got up and he had tears rolling down his cheeks. And he pointed out and he said, Colombia. He saw the Columbia River. To this man, it was a sign of freedom. It was a sign of liberty and civil justice to see the Columbia River after his years behind barbed wires. Here he is crying. I remember that scene in this rail car in 45, returning back to Portland. I remember setting foot at the Union Station here, getting off and turning to my sister Mary and saying, Mary, we're finally home. Japantown is only 7.5 blocks away. Well, she told me, George, we have no home. Don't you remember? We lost everything in 42. And there is no Japantown anymore. And she was right. We couldn't go back to Japantown. There was no Japantown. The Chinese folks had moved into Northwest Portland. I don't mean that as a racial thing, it's just a thing that happened. So we went out to St. John's, to a housing project. We ended up picking berries and picking beans for our very survival. I remember my father having to transfer on public transportation 2 times to get down here to his McBride restaurant that doesn't exist anymore. He had to make mashed potatoes all day long. I thought about that. My father, a rice farmer from Okayama, Japan, an entrepreneur who was successful, who operated a hotel in Japantown, 2 markets on Columbia Boulevard, 3 businesses, he lost everything, and now reduced to making mashed potatoes all day long. Those are the stories of real people here in our town trying to readjust to life, to resettle and start life anew after World War II. We went out to the Rossini Cemetery there on 50th and Fremont Street. There's a separate Japanese cemetery out there. I remember going in there, and before I got into the actual grounds, I noticed something was wrong, because as I peered into the grounds, I saw 2 ladies on their knees weeping. And when I went in, I knew why. All the tombstones were demolished and destroyed. Racial prejudice at its worst. Destroying the final resting place of loved ones because they happen to be Japanese. The Rose City Japanese Cemetery was totally demolished. 1945. And let me remind you of 2017. This year, the destroying of a Jewish cemetery in Philadelphia and the demolishing of a Jewish cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. Haven't we learned? I wonder, I worry about these kinds of things. So here we are back in Portland, trying to make do, and I re-enter school, James John School on Lombard Street in St. John's. School had already started. I went into this new homeroom. The teacher looks me in the eye and she goes, yes, sit in the back of the room. Well, not at a desk, at a table. So I went to the back of the room as ordered, and I sat there. First day, I'm looking forward, and there's a girl in the front desk opening up her little purse, getting out her pocket mirror, and looking back at me. Apparently she'd never ever seen the Japanese before. I don't know what she thought. Was she expecting somebody with horns and whatever, with all the propaganda? Everybody had locker partners, 2 persons to a locker. Nobody would be my locker partner. But somebody stepped forward. His name was Gene Stiles. We became friends. We became friends and remained friends for decades. I used to walk home to our housing project by myself. But then you know what happened was, 2 weeks later, the principal called me into his office. And after some small talk, he said, George, are you being treated fairly? No. I immediately answered no. And Principal Brown looked at me and he said, you know, I understand. You may not know, but I understand. You are not to go back to that home room. I'm transferring you to Miss Simmons' room. I will bring your paper, your books, and your pencils over to you. And I found Miss Simmons, such a compassionate, wonderful human being, as was Principal Brown. And I regained my confidence in education. After a day or two, some of the fellows in that room said, George, do you play football? Well, you know, in Minidoka we had a lot of time. I played football. We had the final game with the other homeroom. Well, the other homeroom was the homeroom I came from. And we're going to meet on the playground, you know, this coming Friday. Maybe it's fate. Suddenly we're playing football. And suddenly, for whatever reason, I catch 2 balls, run them in for touchdown, we win. Now, I'm not the greatest NFL candidate. But for some reason, I'm the hero of the game. And suddenly, 10 people are now my friends. They want to walk with me back to my home. Suddenly, I'm accepted. That's life. Good things happen. In 1976, President Gerald Ford rescinded Executive Order 9066. Well, revoked, rescinded, whatever. In 1983, they put together a blue ribbon committee, and I mean blue ribbon. Judges, CEOs of Fortune 500, presidents of Ivy League school, blue ribbon committee, to review the legality and correctness of Executive Order 9066 and the incarceration of citizens in 1942. Was that correct or not? After 3 months of intensive interviewing of hundreds of people, this commission came with its decision about 9066. It was totally wrong. It's totally wrong for 3 reasons: racial prejudice, the hysteria of war, and the lack of political leadership. I thought about that. That's right. In 1988, President George Bush, Ronald Reagan, sent us a letter of apology. I still have that. I showed it to my children. We had redress. And I've had friends at college and at work ask me, you know, isn't it good to put closure? To have a letter of apology? Isn't that right? They would ask me this. And I'd say, well, in one sense you're right, but you know, you cannot erase 4 years behind barbed wires. You just can't erase that. Those are indelible memories that will stay on forever. When that letter of apology came in 1988, half of the 120,000 people had already passed on, including my mother and father. Yes, I have that letter, but my real wish was that my mother and father had received that letter of apology. That is what was so unfortunate. So, you know, today, as I started, I have concerns when we have the toppling of monuments and these kinds of things, the Ku Klux Klan, what they call the white supremacists. It really concerns me. As one example, you know, the state of West Virginia, they're very proud of Senator Robert Byrd. Some of you have heard that name. Senator Robert Byrd was the longest serving senator in U.S. history. He was a senator for 51 years, idolized. But he was an exalted cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan. He put together many, many arms of the Ku Klux Klan, Robert Byrd. It was only a few years ago that he died. In West Virginia, they have 50 buildings, schools, streets, avenues, monuments to Robert Byrd. So they knocked down 5 statues of Robert E. Lee. Are you also going to remove the 50 things for Robert Byrd? There's not even one breath of that thought. You know, as I mentioned, 41 out of 56 signers were owners of slaves. An executive order of 1863 signed by my idol Abraham Lincoln had a name to it, the Emancipation Proclamation, the road to freedom for over 3 million slaves. I don't think our textbooks really do justice to the telling of the story. When I was drafted in the Army, I was brought down to South Carolina. On a weekend, I went into Columbia. And on Columbia, I saw what was then labeled as a slave market. It just shocked me. It was still standing. This wooden building was slave market. That's the reality of America. Yes, I get concerned that freedom remains very fragile. That with our U.S. Constitution, we become careless. We seem to be very selective. You can have the 14th Amendment, you can have the second, you can have the third Amendment, but some of the others can't. We don't like you. The other day, a friend of mine said, George, once in a while you go out and make these talks. What do you think we need to do here in America? I said, I'm just one person. I have no idea. No, what are some of your thoughts? And I said, well, I'll give you something that just happens all the time. Look at me. This is a Caucasian person. I said, look at me. How would you describe me? Would you describe me as a Japanese American? Well, I guess I could. Well, you know, in America, that person here may be a Korean American. And that person may be a Chinese American. And that person may be a Black American. And that person a Muslim American. And on it goes. There's an absence of people being called Euro-Americans. There's a perception in America that Euro-Americans are the real Americans, and every other ethnic group are kind of side notes. That is attitude. You don't change a country, a people, a direction by legislation. I'm sorry to say that to judges and attorneys, but you don't. You change it by attitude. And as long as a prevailing attitude is that way, I would rather be called an American. Just a plain American. But that doesn't happen. So those are just some thoughts. All of you gave up your lunch hour to come and hear this guy rattling around here, and I really appreciate that. It's good to see Professor Stevenson, Jeswaller, and I meet some of you here today, so thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for your presentation. Bye.